In this job interview training video, I'll teach you the number one tip for landing job offers. The key to getting a job offer isn't your resume, or how well dressed you are, or even who the most qualified candidate is. No, the key to getting a job offer, especially from these guys, your interview panel, is telling great stories. In a job interview, the hiring manager wants to know, do you have the skills to do the job? And they ask probing questions like, can you code in HTML? Or have you dealt with an angry customer? Or can you influence a tough stakeholder? And as a candidate, you're like, I've done all that. I'm your man for the job. But the candidate doesn't back up these claims with a story demonstrating it. They're basically asking the hiring manager to trust them. Well, guess what? The hiring manager isn't going to trust you. They want you to prove it. It is one thing to say you're good at something. It is way more powerful to demonstrate that skill in the context of a story. So let's go through a quick example. Here's a common question. What's your biggest accomplishment? You probably heard that one before, right? Well, when I was a sales assistant at Initech, I was responsible for finding leads for the sales reps. This process was really tedious and boring. I ended up re-engineering the process, and Initech saved a bunch of money, and we ended up being way more productive. So what do you think? Pretty good story, right? You want to know what I thought? I thought that story was more boring than the movie Meet Joe Black. I mean, that story was about as exciting as standing in line at the DMV. But it doesn't matter what I think. How do you think the interview panel reacted? Oh man, they're all asleep except for Bob. I guess someone had to stay awake and ask the questions and take notes. You know, if you tell stories like that, the good thing is you're not alone. As a matter of fact, as an owner of a recruiting firm, I've interviewed over 15,000 professionals. And you know what? 95% of candidates tell stories like that. You might ask, well, why is that? Well, first off, candidates don't think interviewers want to get into the weeds. The other thing is they just can't remember the details because the story they're telling might have happened years ago. But more often than not, it's because the candidate just wasn't prepared for the interview. They didn't have the details at the tip of their tongue to tell the interviewer. And if you don't give good examples in an interview, you know what these guys think, your interview panel? They think you're lying. They think you haven't done anything or just making something up. Now let's ask that interview question again, only this time, let's tell a great story. So, what's your biggest accomplishment? Well, when I was a sales assistant at Initech, I supported our engineering sales team. And one of my duties was to go to the internet, find prospects like vice presidents of engineering, get their contact information. Then I had to manually enter the records into Excel and Salesforce. Next, I had to check for duplicates and finally had to give the leads to sales. The process was tedious and labor intensive, and quite frankly, it led to a lot of turnover in our company because people didn't like to do it. But worst of all, it had a high degree of errors due to the amount of manual data entry. I decided there had to be a better way, so I took the initiative to re-engineer the process. First, I found an online tool called Snob that would automatically scrape contact data on the web and put it in an Excel spreadsheet. Then, I wrote an Excel macro that would merge the documents, cross-reference company names, and eliminate all the duplicates. Next, I worked with our IT department to seamlessly integrate the data into Salesforce. After I tested it, I showed the sales manager. I mean, right now, you're probably like, oh my God, what do you think? How will this end? Hey, come on, work with me here. It's way better than that first story, and it is a business interview after all. It's only so exciting you can make it. But let's go back to our story. He was so ecstatic that when he rolled the process out to 8 other sales assistants, we ended up increasing productivity by 42%. We reduced data entry errors by 85%, and we generated $200,000 a year in annual savings. Best of all for me personally, I received an award and a bonus from the CEO of the company for such an innovative solution. Now, what do you think of that story? That one's pretty good, right? Let's see what the interview panel thought. That's what I thought. She nailed it. Now, let me tell you, if you can tell stories like that in an interview, you are going to get a ton of job offers. So let's teach you how to do that right now. First, you can't just walk into an interview and wing it. These stories need to be built and practiced before the interview. Now, there are 3 parts to building a story. First, we need to find story ideas. Then, we need to build the story. And finally, we need to know when and how to tell them. Let's start first with finding the story. In deciding what stories to pick, here's the criteria I want you to use. First, it should demonstrate a skill the job requires. Next, there should be a conflict or challenge you had to overcome. You also want to pick a story that had a good result. Don't pick something you failed at. And finally, make sure it was something you accomplished, not somebody else. Now, as we build stories, a lot of people say, well, how many, Jeff, do you need to go into an interview? And what I've found is I recommend you construct 5 diverse stories. What I found is with 5 stories, you can usually customize one of them to any question an interviewer might ask or a skill you're trying to demonstrate. Now, when thinking about your story list, a good one to always include is your biggest accomplishment. That's always a great one. You should always have that in your hip pocket. Another good one, no matter what the job is a story of where you influenced a stakeholder that was difficult and how you overcame that and got them bought into whatever you're trying to get them to do. But if you're still struggling for ideas for the other 3, here are some good places to look. First, start with your resume. Now, if you went through our resume training video on building accomplishments, you should have already have several ideas. And if you haven't, make sure to go check out the video at www.jtcc.com/example. It goes through step-by-step how to identify accomplishments. Your resume, though, should provide ideas if you haven't had a chance to do that. Another great place to find ideas are any old projects you worked on. Go back and look at any of the old documents you have, PowerPoint slides, Excel spreadsheets. I guarantee you accomplished some pretty cool stuff you've forgotten about. And if you go back and look at that stuff, you're going to find those great projects you did and some of the cool things you accomplished. The last place I recommend are job descriptions, the jobs that you're going out and applying for. For example, look at this Facebook job description for a product manager. There are a lot of great ideas here. Here's one. Define and analyze metrics that inform the success of products. Maybe you designed a cool metric you can discuss. Or look at this one, designing user interfaces. Obviously, if you applied for this job, you'd probably design a couple user interfaces. Talk about a really cool user interface you designed and all the challenges you faced with that. Okay, now that you have your stories identified, now we need to go build them. To help us, we're going to use a blueprint, a standard way to tell each story. And the blueprint we're going to use is something called the STAR method. Each letter represents a step in the story. The first step is where we describe the background of the situation. Next is the task, where we describe the conflict, obstacle, or goal you were tasked with. The third step is the action. This is the juiciest step in your story where we describe your solution. The final step is where we quantify the results of that solution. Now, you might already know the STAR method. And I prepped several candidates, and they say, yeah, Jeff, I already know the STAR method. I already use it. But you know what? They still tell horrible stories. The secret ingredient to using STAR is something I call specificity. You have to get specific in each of your steps. You can't talk in generalities. And this is the biggest mistake people make. They talk in generalities. They don't get specific with people and titles and challenges and solutions. That's the key. You got to use specifics. And as we think about using the STAR method, let's not forget the tenets of a good story. Like any good book or movie, we have characters that are both heroes and villains. I want to know who they are. It doesn't have to necessarily be a person, by the way. The villain could be a computer system. We want a vivid setting. We want a compelling plot. We need a conflict. Every story needs a conflict for it to be interesting. We need some kind of conflict, or climax, and ultimately we want a resolution. It's the same thing for telling stories in an interview. So let's compare the 2 stories using STAR. First, we need to set up the situation. Now look at the difference between the bad and good story. In the bad one, she said, I worked as an assistant. In the good one, she gave a lot more detail. She described the company, the role she had, what the specific name of the team was she supported. These are all subtle details and minor details, but what they do is they start to build color to a story. They start to make it more interesting. By the way, we have a worksheet at jeffthecareercoach.com that you can go and download. I recommend you do that. It will make this process a lot easier, and you'll have it in one place, and it'll be way easier for you to practice it before you go into interviews. Now, in the task section, we need to describe the challenge you are faced with. Now again, notice the difference in the detail. In the good story, she got very specific with each step of the process. It helps the hiring manager picture the situation. And heck, he might have been facing the same issue right now, and you're providing him a solution like, wow, this is the girl I should hire. Now, the action is the juiciest step of the story. This is where you get to tell all the cool things you did. Now, notice how specific she was in the solution. She named the actual software tool she used, in this case, something called Snob. She said she used an Excel macro, which, without saying I'm an awesome in Excel, she basically demonstrated an expertise level in Excel. Finally, we need to share the results. And this is the key. Whenever possible, you want to quantify the benefit you added to the company. This is where a lot of candidates struggle. If you have time, by the way, I recommend you go through our video that teaches candidates how to quantify the benefits of your accomplishments. And you can go get that video at www.jtcc.com/example. But let's say you don't have the time to do that. You might have an interview tomorrow. And you can't remember the results of the projects you're putting for your stories. It's okay to estimate the results. Okay? Everybody does it, and it's perfectly normal to do this. However, if you do estimate, first, make sure you don't exaggerate. If you over-exaggerate, it could cost you an offer. And it's just not worth it, right? Second, you need to make sure whatever numbers you use, you can defend. Again, it's okay to use an estimate. Just make sure they're reasonable. Now that the stories have been found and built, I need to teach you how to tell them. Now, again, I said this earlier. I recommend you download our form. And then once you get this, they're all in one spot. You need to practice, practice, practice. Do it in front of the mirror. Get to the point you know the information so well it sounds natural when you tell the story. Now, when you practice, you need to tell your story in only 2 to 3 minutes. If it takes you longer than 3 minutes, you either have too much information or it's a poorly structured story. 3 minutes is the absolute max, and you really want to shoot for 2 minutes if you can. Also, you only need to tell 1 to 2 stories per interview. Just because you prepared 5 doesn't mean you need to tell every single one of them in the interview. Also, if you do have multiple interviews with the same company, let's say you're going for an interview and you have 5 interviewers in the same day, you want to make sure you don't tell the same story over and over again in each interview. When those interviewers go and debrief, they're going to think like, wow, is that the only story that guy has? So you want to make sure you mix up your stories. Another tip, a lot of candidates will come back to me and tell me, Jeff, they never asked me for a story. Guess what? They're often not going to ask you for a story. It is your responsibility and yours alone to get your stories in the interview, even if they don't ask for one. Now, let me give you 2 magic words that are going to help make this happen. No, it's not abracadabra. Abracadabra, I think it's 1 word, isn't it? I don't even know if that's 2 anyways. The 2 words are, for example. If an interviewer asks, what is your biggest strength? And you say, I'm great at project management, for example. Or say an interviewer doesn't ask you any questions. They just talk about the role and the challenges they're facing. Listen intently, wait for your spot, and then when you get an opening, say something like, wow, well, that's a challenge we face a lot at ABC Corporation, for example. You see how that works? It's a perfect transition for you to get in your story into the interview. Now, this video just scratches the surface of our tips and tricks to prepare you finding a job. Check out the rest of our videos at jtcc.com. And if you liked this video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked it. And please don't be shy about leaving a comment.